What's going on, good people? It's your boy John, here to do something a little different today. I'm gonna be reading to you all this morning. So, the book that we'll be covering today and for a while is called Beethoven Variations on a Life by Mark Evan Bonds. It's a great book. I've read it already, so I figured I would share it to you all because of how cool the information is on the inside. So Mark Evan Bonds is the Carrie G. Boshammer Distinguished Professor of Music at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he has taught since 1992. A former editor-in-chief of Beethoven Forum, he has written widely on the music of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. As far as I understand it, he's kind of a bit more of a romantic writer on Beethoven. I think nowadays people have a less romantic view of Beethoven's life, so he's kind of a little bit more old school. But, I like the romantic side of Beethoven, bring out some of the stardom of his life. So let's see what the inside flap says. Despite the ups and downs of his personal life and personal career, professional career, in the face of deafness, Beethoven remained remarkably consistent in his most basic convictions about his art. This inner consistency, writes the music historian Mark Evan Bonds, provides the key to understanding the composer's life and works. Beethoven approached music as he approached life, weighing whatever occupied him from a variety of perspectives: a melodic idea, a musical genre, a word or phrase, a friend, a lover, a patron, money, politics, religion. His ability to unlock so many possibilities from each helps explain the emotional breadth and richness of his output as a whole. From the heaven-storming Ninth Symphony to the eccentric Eighth, and from the arcane Great Fugue to the crowd-pleasing Wellington's Victory. Beethoven's works, Bonds argues, are a series of variations on his life. The iconic scowl, so familiar from later images of the composer, is but one of many attitudes he could assume and project through his music. The supposedly characteristic furrowed brow and frown, moreover, came only after his time. Discarding tired myths about the composer, Bonds proposes a new way of listening to Beethoven by hearing his music as an expression of his entire self, not just his scowling self. Very nice. Moving on. Let's see. As you can tell, this is not going to be a professional recording or anything. I'll probably make some mistakes, but I'm going to do these all in one take. See how it goes. Introduction. Vienna, March 26th, 1827, late afternoon. Having scrawled his name to a legal document with the little strength he has left, the gravely ill and nearly deaf composer is now in a coma. A bolt of lightning splits the sky. A clap of thunder follows. Beethoven opens his eyes, raises a fist towards heaven, sinks back, and dies. So legend would have it, or at least one of the legends. Accounts of Beethoven's death vary widely, and this one dates from more than 30 years after the event. There may be a grain of truth to it, for weather records confirmed the early spring thunderstorm that day, even if other details remain suspect. Separating fact from fiction is a major challenge for anyone who wants to come to grips with Beethoven and his music. Yet, without the friction, Beethoven's life is the stuff of movies. The characters and the plots are ready-made for the screen. A talented young musician and the plot are ready-made for the screen. Just a second, I'm going to turn myself down a little bit. A talented young musician, the son of an alcoholic father, leaves his provincial home and dazzles high society in the imperial capital as a pianist and composer. But tragedy strikes in the form of deafness, and our hero, rejected by the woman he loves, withdraws into a world of his own and writes music he cannot hear. He turns his isolation into an asset and wins acclaim as his generation's greatest composer of instrumental music. Commissions from abroad pour in during the final years of his life. Tens of thousands attend his funeral. It is a compelling story and true enough in its outlines, but where does the music fit into all of this? Generations of critics, including Hollywood scriptwriters, have projected Beethoven's life onto his works, treating his music as if it were the soundtrack to the life. The temptation is understandable, for his style did indeed change remarkably over the course of his career. If we know anything about his life at all, it is difficult to hear the unconventional piano sonatas and string quartets of his last decade without imagining the sense of isolation his near-total deafness must have forced on him. When we listen to these late compositions against the backdrop of those earlier works from the heroic period, works that, like the Fifth Symphony, move from struggle to triumph, we sense that something has changed in the person who created them. The temptation to map the works onto the life is particularly strong in biographies, which by their very nature move in a more or less straight line through time, with the music often functioning as an audible diary of sorts. But this chronological approach, valuable as it may be, creates a share of blind spots. It tends to emphasize change over continuity and favor those works that move the stylistic needle toward a destination we know in advance. It struggles to account for large swaths of the composer's output and downplays those many compositions that did not fit the narrative of continuous change. Beethoven Variations on a Life, this book, is not a biography, nor does it follow a chronological path. For all the ups and downs of his personal life and professional career, Beethoven remained remarkably consistent in his most fundamental convictions about himself and his art. And it is this inner consistency that provides the key to understanding the relationship between his life and his works. Beethoven approached music in much the same way he approached life. He liked to adopt multiple perspectives on whatever attracted his attention. A thematic idea, a musical genre, a friend, a patron, money, politics, religion. This is the same stuff from the inner flap. He did not go through life with a perpetual frown on his face, and we should be wary of equating too quickly the emotions we hear in his music with his own personal feelings. Indeed, we shortchange our experience of his music if we think of him as the misanthropic, suffering soul he has so often been made out to be. His music is the creation of an individual far more complex than the iconic scowl. The question, then, is not how any particular event shaped any particular work, but rather how the events of his life shaped his broader vision of his art, which ultimately served to frame everything he wrote. The life, in other words, influenced the works, though not in ways that allow us to draw direct lines between the two. The challenge is to relate Beethoven to all of his music and not just some of it. This means going beyond the triumphant heroic compositions to include such works as the zany Eighth Symphony, the enigmatic Bagatelle for piano, Opus 126, number 1, and the Janus-faced finale of the Serioso String Quartet, Opus 95. Beethoven thought of himself not simply as a composer, but as a tone poet, Tondichter in German, an artist who poeticizes through music. This was, in his time, a new word for a new kind of artist, and it is particularly fitting in Beethoven's case, for his music, like poetry, speaks to something deep within the human soul and demands interpretation. It compels us to move beyond the immediacy of the surface to grasp what it is that stirs us so profoundly. Tone poet remains as timely today, some 250 years after Beethoven's birth, as it was during his own lifetime. What an introduction. What an introduction. Chapter 1. The Scowl. There is no right or wrong ways to listen to Beethoven's music, but some are more accommodating than others. The first thing to get past is the scowl. It is hard to avoid, for it confronts us everywhere, from album covers and dust jackets to monumental statues and those little white busts that adorn upright pianos. Even experienced listeners find it difficult to repress the stern visage behind the music. When we hear works such as the Fifth Symphony or the Appassionata Sonata that are intense and even violent, it fits, and we can be forgiven if we conjure up the image of a deeply furrowed brow when we listen to the gloomy, meditative first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. The scowl is an outward manifestation of inner turmoil, and these are the kinds of works that seem to come directly from the soul of their creator, the soul of their creator. Yet, when we listen to works that contradict this rictus of suffering, the laugh-out-loud Eighth Symphony or the tuneful, rollicking finale of the Piano Sonata, Opus 79, for example, we struggle to reconcile what we are hearing with the image of a composer who was supposedly self-absorbed, turned inward, and uninterested in presenting himself to the world in any sort of agreeable manner. We are disappointed, moreover, by the very existence of such crowd-pleasing potboilers as the Wellington's Victory, complete with simulated cannon and musket fire, or Der glorious Augenblick, the glorious moment, written for the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to celebrate the restoration of monarchical rule across Europe in the wake of Napoleon. For many listeners, such works somehow do not represent the real Beethoven, that is, the scowling Beethoven. What then are we to do with all these many works, the bulk of his output, in fact, that contradict the scowl? One option is to listen to Beethoven in the way his contemporaries did. This involves more than playing his music on period instruments and attending to performance practices of his time. Our ears could benefit from a change too. We cannot erase from our minds all the music we know from the past 2 centuries, but we can approach his works with fresh ears if we try to put ourselves in the concert hall seats of Beethoven's contemporaries. To begin with, they had no notion of the scowl. The average music lover of Beethoven's day knew very little about him as a person. The few images of him that circulated during his lifetime shows a serious face, but this was true of almost any formal portrait of that era. The scowl became iconic only later, reinforced by such turbulent and popular works as the Pathétique, Moonlight, and Appassionata piano concertos, and above all, the Fifth Symphony. In his own time, Beethoven was little more than a name. Even E.T.A. Hoffman, or Nutcracker of Nutcracker fame, who in the 1910s wrote lengthy and penetrating critiques of the composer's works, seems to have known next to nothing about the person behind the music. Nor did the composer's contemporaries know much about his deafness, especially if they lived outside of Vienna. The earliest published account of it appeared in 1816, and only toward the end of his life did critics begin to speculate on how his condition might have been affecting his latest works. Not until after his death did the circumstances of deafness become central to the perception of his music. Here's a nice picture. Even when the performers smile, the composer scowls. A conductor, Vasily Petrenko, gestures towards a bust of Beethoven after a 2013 Proms concert at Royal Albert Hall, London, created by Johann Nepomuk Schaller sometime after 1827. The bust regularly adorned the stage of Royal Philharmonic Society concerts from 1871 until 1980. So to our audio listeners, this Vasily Petrenko, awesome conductor, is pointing towards the bust of Beethoven right here, with the scowl as described. What is more revealing still is that even those in Vienna who were aware of his deafness, his unhappy love affairs, and his generally dour public countenance did not hear his music as an expression of his inner self. Excuse me. The reason for this was quite simple. They did not hear anyone's music in this way. It would not have occurred to even the most sophisticated listeners of the time to hear music as a form of sonic autobiography. Audiences judged what they heard on its ability to move them. The notion that the emotions portrayed in a sonata or a symphony might be those of the composer would have been quite foreign to Beethoven's contemporaries. Literature was another matter. There, the idea of autobiographical art had taken hold more than a generation before, and Goethe was one, or should I say Goethe? Was one of its chief proponents, at least in his early years. His works, he declared in his autobiography, were fragments of a great confession, and readers absorbed them as such. Music, however, was slow to catch up. Listeners began to hear Beethoven's works as self-expressive only in retrospect. When the first biographies began to appear shortly after his death, audiences learned for the first time of the composer's constant ill health, and they began to hear the third movement of the string quartet in A minor, opus 132, labeled A Convalescent's Holy Song of Thanksgiving to the Deity, as Beethoven's own personal song of thanksgiving. When they read about his profound love of nature, they began to hear the Pastoral Symphony as an expression of his love of nature. When they read in his correspondence of his resolve to grab fate by the throat, they heard the Fifth Symphony as a musical expression of that resolve. It soon became an article of faith that Beethoven had bared his soul in his music. The French critic Chrétien Aran deemed the Ninth Symphony a summary of its creator's entire life, the secret of his entire inner existence, his moral biography. The Russian biographer Alexander Ulybyshev declared that what he sought in the composer's music was, above all, Beethoven himself, the innermost of his self. With Beethoven's symphonies, the German critic and literary historian Julian Schmidt observed in 1853, "We have the feeling that we are dealing with something very different from the usual alternations of joy and sorrow in which wordless music ordinarily moves. We intuit the mysterious abyss of a spiritual world, and we torment ourselves in an effort to understand it. We want to know what drove the tone poet to bottomless despair and to unalloyed joy. We want to gain an understanding from the mysteriously beautiful features of this Sphinx. Kind of a side note, as I do enjoy what they think about the Ninth Symphony being kind of an autobiography, which I totally agree with. But all this lay in the future. Listeners in Beethoven's own lifetime regarded him more in the manner of Shakespeare, a figure about whom they knew even less, but whom they admired all the more as an author of immense emotional and technical range. An author capable of transcending any one particular genre or mood. Readers marveled in particular at Shakespeare's ability to juxtapose not only contrasting and diverse characters in a single work, Iago and Desdemona, Lear and Cordelia, Shylock and Portia, many examples, but also contrasting and diverse modes of drama. The shift from tragic to comic and back again occurs with stunning frequency in his plays, and they heard the same sort of contrast in Beethoven's music. It is scarcely coincidental that the composer's contemporaries likened him to Shakespeare on more than one occasion, or that he himself was a devoted enthusiast of the bard. As we listen, then, it helps to remember that Beethoven's audiences regarded all composers rather as playwrights, musical scores as the equivalent of scripts, performers as actors, and they valued the variety that came with such emotional elasticity. When a Viennese critic of the time called Beethoven our Proteus, he did so with pride and respect, for like the shape-shifting sea god, only the Protean artist had the ability to take on whatever form he chose. Such an artist could transcend the limits of self-inclination and embrace any imaginable emotion or state of mind. To be truly free and educated, as the poet and philosopher Friedrich Schlegel noted at the time, an individual would have to be able to tune himself at will, at any time philosophically or philologically, critically or poetically, historically or rhetorically, à l'antique, à la moderne, in an entirely arbitrary fashion, and to any degree in the way one tunes an instrument. For our audio listeners, here's another early sketch from 1918 of Beethoven, where kind of the quintessential serious look comes in. I think they're trying to show that it's not just a regular scowl, but that is kind of how people looked in sketches at the time. He's got quite the cleft in his chin. By this line of thought, Beethoven tuned and retuned himself constantly. He was nothing if not Protean, consistently capable of assuming new guises in his art. He adopted a certain sense of distance while composing. As Hoffman put it in his 1810 review of the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven separates his eye from the inner realm of musical tones and commands that domain as an absolute ruler. Beethoven could, and no doubt did, use music as an outlet for his personal feelings on more than one occasion. But to assume that this was his standard way of composing leads to a rather narrow mode of perception, one in which we welcome those works that correspond to the scowl and marginalize those that do not. The astonishing variety of Beethoven's music compels us to look elsewhere for a common creative denominator. Paradoxical as it may seem, Beethoven's ability to adopt multiple perspectives towards any given object was a constant feature of his inner self. He approached music in much the same way he approached everything in life. He liked to look at whatever was before him: a musical idea, a name, a word, a poem, a social situation, even another person, from many different angles, and explore their implications and consequences to the fullest. The best known example of this in his music is the four-note opening of the Fifth Symphony. The motif, with its distinctive rhythm of short, short, long, short, 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 long, short, 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 long, returns repeatedly throughout all four movements and never in exactly the same form. Beethoven changes its pitches, intervals, harmony, and the instrumentation, and at times retains only the rhythm. Having presented the idea in unison at the very beginning of the first movement, he proceeds at once to manipulate it. The first violins, second violins, and violas toss the brief fragment around and among themselves, almost as if they were playing a game of tag, changing the pitches slightly over time. The other instruments of the orchestra soon join in, and we hear at once how malleable this brief and seemingly simple musical idea really is. Even when Beethoven introduces a contrasting lyrical theme, marked dolce, we hear a variant of the four-note motif rumbling along underneath in the low strings. Dun 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 dun, and underneath there's like a da 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 da. I think that's what they're talking about. This sort of intense thematic manipulation is basic to almost everything Beethoven wrote. He liked the challenge of making something out of almost nothing, and better still, making many things out of a single almost nothing. The greater the contrast, the better. The opening of the piano trio in D major, Opus 70, number 1, The Ghost, begins with a loud, almost violent downward four-note unison gesture that is repeated in rapid succession by all three instruments playing in unison, each time starting on an ever higher note. Totally recommend The Ghost piano trio, folks. Totally recommend. The idea could scarcely be simpler, but after the fifth time, the cello, without warning, inverts this downward figure and turns it into the beginning of a lyrical melody that soars upwards and then goes on to serve as the principal theme for the movement as a whole. Whether we realize it or not, these two very different themes reveal different perspectives on a basic idea. The sketchbooks bear repeated witness to thematic manipulations of this kind. Once we have alighted upon a musical idea, no matter how brief, Beethoven would jot it down and begin to explore its potential by looking at it from multiple perspectives. Beethoven treated language in much the same way. At the beginning of the finale to his last string quartet, Opus 135, he added words beneath the music's two principal motifs. The cello opens by asking, "Muss es sein?" Must it be? The words set in a simple three-note motif that moves down and then up in a contour that mirrors a questioning tone of voice. The words are not meant to be sung, though the three syllables fit the notes precisely. The tempo is slow, the mode is minor, the mood somber. This darkness disappears the moment the tempo shifts from slow to fast, and the mode from minor to major. Here the motif moves up and then down, emulating the contour of a declarative statement. For it is at this point that Beethoven provides the answer to the question by inverting the order of the opening two simples. Es muss sein. It must be. Exactly what it is has long been a matter of speculation. Beethoven labeled the whole movement the resolution achieved with difficulty. But the object of that resolution is elicited widely varying explanations extending from the trivial, a composer's response to his cook's request for more money, to the metaphysical, a joyous acceptance of morality. This in itself points to the ability of the music to take us in multiple different directions at the time. Like words, notes are capable of manipulations that can change their meanings entirely. Beethoven's correspondence is full of such verbal permutations. He once closed a letter to his friend Nicholas von Schmeschal, who happened to be a baron, with this curious string of variations. Adieu, Baron Baron, and glossed it with a mixture of French and German. Voilà, quelque chose au den alten blabla. There's something about the old pawn shop. Punning on the German word Versatsamt, pawn shop, itself based on the root word versetzen, to transpose, in the sense not only of goods exchanged for money, as in a pawn shop, but also in the sense of letters, movable type that have been transposed, hence the 5 different possible permutations on the last 3 letters of Baron. Any Germans out there, come at me. Beethoven could never resist a good pun. He enjoyed playing on the similar sounds of the words of gelehrt, learned, and gelehrt, emptied, verleger, published, and verlegen, embarrassed. Note, need, and note, musical note. These two are verbal manifestations of what Beethoven liked to do with musical themes. Turn them inside out and upside down to make the same basic material function in very different ways. Musical puns abound in his music. The loud, opening phrase of the first movement of the 8th Symphony, for example, functions as its quiet final cadence. What we remember as the opening of the movement also turns out to be its close. Beethoven was not the first to do this kind of thing. Joseph Haydn had led the way a generation before, but Beethoven took this tendency to a new extreme, so much so that he managed to baffle even many of his contemporaries who wanted to understand his music. The ability to look at a single object from multiple perspectives is delightfully evident in his 2 different settings of L'amant impatient. I think that's right. The Impatient Lover, Opus 82, numbers 3 and 4, for solo voice and piano. The text is an aria from a much earlier opera libretto by the Italian poet Pietro Metastasio, sung by a female character who fears she has been abandoned. I will not read the Italian. I will read the translations. What is my beloved doing? Why does he not come? Does he want to see me to languish like this? Oh, how slow the course of the sun. Every moment seems like a day to me. A lament of unrequited love, perhaps? Here we go. On the surface, this is a standard lament, the kind of thing found in countless operas. Yet words can convey different meanings according to how we say or sing them. Our understanding of such expressions as, "Yeah, sure," or "What a surprise!" depends very much on the tone of voice. In this particular case, freed from the contingency of an operatic plot, Beethoven chose to create two entirely different songs using exactly the same text. The first, marked Arietta Buffa, comic Arietta, is fast and bouncy, set in the bright major mode and with a busy, scurrying accompaniment throughout. It conveys a tone of exasperation in the singer's repeated così, like this, at the end, makes the overall effective comic indeed. One has the feeling that the beloved will be in deep trouble when he finally does show up. The second setting marked Arietta assai seriosa, a very serious arietta, by contrast draws on every cliché on the repertory of musical laments. Minor mode, slow tempo, grinding dissonances, and a hesitant melodic line, with plenty of drooping intervals that mimic a lover's sighs. It is all done to such an extreme, in fact, that we can hear the song either as a lament or as a parody of a lament, overdone to the point of farce. The key word here is seriosa, which in Italian can mean either extremely serious or overly serious, which is to say, serious to the point of absurdity. So I guess in the first version, when it's faster, it's kind of like, where the heck is my lover? Like, there are chores to be done. Where the heck is that guy? And then there's like a real serious, I am actually in love with this person. Where the heck is this person? I want this person next to me. But then there's like an extreme version where you're just like, oh my god, this person is ridiculous, you know? The same word, or continuing on now, the same word helps explain the unexpectedly sunny ending to the otherwise gloomy string quartet in F minor, Opus 95, which Beethoven called Quartetta Serioso. After three deeply serious movements, Beethoven launches into an equally gloomy finale in a moderate tempo, which seems headed inevitably toward a dark conclusion. Just before the end, the music interrupts itself, accelerates to a fast tempo, shifts to a major tone, and introduces an entirely new and jaunty tune that seems diametrically opposed to everything we had heard up to that point. The entire piece is over less than a minute later. This brief ending seems to mock everything that had come before. In his life, as in his music, Beethoven frequently moved without warning between serious and comic, high and low, sublime and slapstick. Even in his performances as a pianist, he could distance himself from his art and draw attention to the craft of manipulating emotions as well as notes. His pupil, Carl Czerny, recalled how Mozart could move a room full of listeners to tears through his improvisations at the keyboard, and then afterward mocked them for those very tears. Here's a quote from Carl Czerny. His improvisation was most brilliant and striking. In whatever company he might chance to be, he knew how to produce such an effect upon every hearer that frequently not an eye remained dry, while many would break out into loud sobs, for there was something wonderful in his expression in addition to the beauty and originality of his ideas, in his spirited style of rendering them. After ending an improvisation of this kind, he would burst into loud laughter and banter his hearers on the emotion he had caused in them. "You are fools," he would say. Sometimes he would feel himself insulted by these indications of sympathy. "Who could live among such spoiled children?" he would cry. Back to Bonds. It would be easy to dismiss this as an entertaining yet possibly apocryphal anecdote, if it did not resonate with so many moments in music that Beethoven committed to paper, including but by no means limited to the mood-disrupting coda to the finale of the Seriosa String Quartet. As one French critic so colorfully put it after hearing an unidentified symphony by Beethoven in 1811, having penetrated the listener's spirit with a sweet melancholy, he shreds it at once with a mass of barbarous chords. It strikes me as if we were seeing doves and crocodiles penned together. Or as the pianist Jeremy Denk has noted more recently, he's a trickster, an unreliable narrator, willing to whip out the rug out from under you, scheming behind your back how to mislead you next. Beethoven could be at once wholly engaged and wholly detached. Perhaps nowhere in this sense of multiple perspectives were clearly on display than in the string quartet in B flat major, Opus 130, a work with two utterly different finales. The original version from December 1825 ends with a massive fugue that dwarfs all preceding movements in both scale and tone. The Viennese publisher Domenico Artaria recognized difficulties as extremely long and demanding finale would pose for performers as well as listeners. Let me say that again, because this comes up a lot. Recognized that difficulties this extremely long and demanding finale would pose for performers as well as listeners, and for this reason requested and offered to pay for a different finale. Beethoven complied, producing a much shorter and lighter movement with driving dance rhythms. Artaria then published the original finale as a separate work of its own, the Grosse Fugue, Opus 133. It would be cynical to think that Beethoven had created the new finale for money alone. At this late point in his life, he had his choice of commissions. Artaria's offer was unusual in that it gave him an opportunity to end the same work in two different ways. The fact that both finales have their advocates today speaks to the ability of each to close things out convincingly, each in its own way. Nor was the idea of an alternative finale unique to Opus 130. According to Czerny, Beethoven at one point even contemplated writing a purely instrumental finale to the Ninth Symphony. Wow. Had he lived longer, Beethoven might very well have carried out this plan. That he would even contemplate the idea speaks volume about his inclination to adopt contrasting perspectives in any number of situations. This tendency extended at times towards people as well. His correspondence reveals a constant series of turbulent relationships that break and then heal, and sometimes break again. He was quick to change his mind about the loyalty of those around him. The case of Stefan von Breunig was typical. One of Beethoven's closest friends from his Bonn days, Breunig shared a flat with the composer in Vienna for a time in 1804. And in a letter to their mutual Bonn friend, Franz Gerhard Wegeler, he described the strain of daily contact aggravated by the composer's growing deafness. Something must have happened a few weeks later, for in early November, Beethoven sent a miniature portrait of himself to Breunig with the wish that, here's a quote from nowhere. What happened between us be concealed forever behind this painting. I know I have wounded your heart. My own emotion, which you certainly must have observed, has punished me enough for it. It was not malice within me that was directed towards you. Had that been the case, I would never be worthy of your friendship. It was passion in you and in me but distrust of you began to stir within me. Individuals came between us, ones who will never be worthy of you or me. Forgive me if I hurt you. I myself suffered no less when I did not see you for so long beside me.
Only then did I realize so vividly how dear you are to my heart and always will be. Now that's a bromance right there. We can see a similar pattern in other correspondence with Wegeler himself, Eleanor von Breuning, Johann Nepomuk Malzer, Countess Mary Erdödy, and even Prince Lichnowsky, his most important patron during his early years in Vienna. Beethoven's personal relationships were as mutable as his musical ideas. He could compartmentalize his creative energies to an astonishing degree. He often worked on several compositions at more or less the same time, rather like those chess masters who take on multiple opponents simultaneously and play each board in sequence. This approach also testifies to his ability to tune and retune himself in the sense proposed by Friedrich Schlegel. He could enter and leave contrasting musical worlds with apparent ease, no matter how extreme the differences among the various works before him. He reported to Wegeler in 1801 that he often had 3 or 4 different compositions in progress at any given moment. And he told a visitor in 1816 that, "I don't write anything in one fell swoop without interruption. I always work on many things at the same time. I pick up now this and now that." The sketches for the wholly different Fifth and Sixth Symphonies composed over the same span of time certainly confirms this. Finally, we have Beethoven's own word on the need for composers to be able to step outside themselves when creating new works. He was in a foul mood when he wrote to the publisher Breitkopf and Hartel in February 1812, for Archduke Rudolph, his most important patron in the last 2 decades of his life, had recently declined his right as coadjutor to become Archbishop of Olmütz, thereby dashing Beethoven's expectations of a stable and highly desirable post, which would have been his patron's new court. He was in such despair at this news that he had to acknowledge his momentary inability to do something that artists in particular must be able to do easily: convey a mood different from that which they actually feel. Here's a quote. "For now I can write only what is absolutely necessary. You say that good humor sparkles in my last letter. Artists have to be able to throw themselves often into anything and everything, and so this good humor, too, might have been feigned, for I am precisely not in good humor at the moment." Back to Bonds. This is not to say that Beethoven did not genuinely feel the emotions we hear in his music. That these emotions were routinely imagined makes them no less real for purposes of composing. But composing for him was above all a matter of arousing an emotional response in listeners, not of expressing his inner self. He belonged to the last generation of composers who treated musical or instrumental music as a rhetorical art. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, and composers had long considered it their responsibility, aided by performers, to persuade listeners emotionally, to transport them into particular emotional states. The idea that listeners might somehow bear the burden of understanding, that it may be up to them to grasp what a composer was trying to say, speaks to a mode of listening that would not gain a foothold until late in the 19th century. Beethoven's music did in fact become increasingly enigmatic over the course of his life, especially in his last decade, but one of the many reasons so many of his contemporaries puzzled over what he had written was that they were simply not accustomed to the notion of listening as an activity that required any special effort on their part. We routinely accept that responsibility today, and there is nothing wrong with looking to the person of the composer to make sense of what that individual has created. But if our image of that individual lacks depth, our experience of the music suffers. In the case of Beethoven, the scowl is real enough, but it makes him one-dimensional. It is a caricature, and like many caricature, it exaggerates distinctive features of the individual it portrays. Beethoven scowled, but he also laughed, and to judge from contemporary reports, he did so often and quite heartily. Scowling or laughing, he was able to distance himself from his own transitory emotions and create fictional worlds that we as listeners can inhabit at our pleasure. That is the end of chapter 1. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see what happens in chapter 2. Hopefully that whets your appetite for more. Alright, thanks for listening all. Look forward to next time. Take care.